be familiar with many of the historic rulings that Mr. Justice Kirby gave during his time as the longest serving member of the Australian judiciary. And these were not easy rulings in non-controversial cases on matters of privacy, on matters of gay rights, on matters of migrant rights, issues that were demanding and tough and intellectually acute. I think it's fair to say that Mr. Justice Kirby stood his ground and cut new ground in a way that was not only remarkable for Australian society and constructive, but for all those legal traditions where we share in the English-speaking world the kind of work that's done by outstanding justices across the high courts of the Commonwealth and the United States. I first met Mr. Justice Kirby when he and I sat with some others on something called the Eminent Persons Group of the Commonwealth, where the challenge was human rights, rule of law, and reforming an organization which we all felt could be doing substantially more. And I can tell you that we had members of the committee, some of whom, our chairman was the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, a Muslim country. One of our members was a very distinguished jurist from Pakistan, Dr. Asma Jahangir, who was head of the Supreme Court Bar and who had stood up to Mr. Musharraf about judicial independence. And we all talk about principle. Asma went to jail in defense of principle. And we were able to produce, really through Michael's remarkable work, a charter for the Commonwealth. Values, underlying principles, which Her Majesty signed on Commonwealth Day in 2013. And while the Commonwealth has not yet achieved all the principles underlined, it is now a target document which successions of Commonwealth leaders will have to respond to. The first draft of that document was done on cocktail napkins on a flight between Australia and Malaysia by our guest of honor this afternoon. And those cocktail napkins are now preserved in perpetuity, the Commonwealth Secretariat, along with the actual charter itself, which, unlike the original draft, is on parchment. We are honored to have Michael with us here at Massey. We are also honored that in his first visit outside of Ottawa, as the new ambassador for Korea, His Excellency Ambassador Cho would grace us with his presence and with a very thoughtful presentation at the Korea Strategy Conference across the way at the Monk Center. The truth of the matter is that while countries have different backgrounds, different histories, different cultural realities, there is a common principle around human rights that is fundamental. And that is why none of us who know about Michael's remarkable history would have been surprised when the Secretary General of the United Nations gave him the job of being a special envoy to report on the human rights circumstance in the DPRK. Think about the logistics of that. Think about the nature of that challenge. But his report has come out. It's gone to the Security Council. It's gone and been approved by the United Nations General Assembly. Think about the dynamics of that. So we're honored to have Michael with us, and he has asked if he could wander around with a microphone. I think he's picking up that Rosalia Bella thing. Didn't want to stand behind a podium, and I know he'll want to take questions after his presentation. Michael.
Thank you very much, Hugh, and thank you for this warm welcome to Massey College. It's marvellous to be here and in your company, because we struck a blow for the future of the Commonwealth to make sure it does have a future and fulfills the aspirations that you and I and our colleagues unanimously shared on the Eminent Persons Group. I'd like to acknowledge the presence here of the former Justice Frank Iacobucci, Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada. we have been friends for 30 years. There is no mafia so powerful as the mafia of the judges of final national courts. It's a purely intellectual company, but I had the great privilege of going to a conference every year in Yale Law School when Frank Iacobucci was one of the stars, talking about the growing impact of international law on our domestic decision making, a matter which is relevant to the subject I'm going to talk about today. I'd like also to acknowledge the presence here of Jean Riley, thank her for being here and reminding us of the history of Canada and the history that we in Australia share, of having been part of the United Nations force that responded so quickly within a day to the invasion of the Republic of Korea by forces of the North Korean regime. And so all of us are here to talk about something which is much more tricky, much more difficult than the subject of international trade treaties. International trade treaties are themselves very tricky and very difficult. And I was told that tomorrow, Ian told me, tomorrow is the key D-Day for the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement in the Congress of the United States. That's a bit of a mixed bag, so we'll all be watching that with great attention tomorrow. And in fact, I'll be in Washington tomorrow for the World Bank. But here I am to talk about the work that was done on North Korea, and I'm going to follow the example of Ambassador Joe and not stand guarded by the podium. How many speakers want to have a podium between them and you? Well, I'm out here with you, and here's the Korean Students Association at this table. What a wonderful thing. Korean, Canadian students who are here and looking into the future, peering into that dark space which is North Korea when seen from a satellite. You've probably seen that image. A blaze of light in the Republic of Korea, one of the most dynamic economies in the world. A blaze of light in China, and a blaze of light in Japan, and a dark space with just little pinpricks of light around Pyongyang. Now, let us remember that today, well, actually in the Eastern Pacific, the dawn has just gone up on the 12th of June. And the 12th of June 2015 is the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. 800 years ago, tomorrow here, today in the Eastern Pacific, the barons of England appeared before King John at Runnymede and told him that he was under the law. He was an absolute monarch. He was the monarch of all that he surveyed. He was trying to raise more and more money to fight wars to reclaim territory in France, which was for hundreds of years the great battle between the kings of England and their erstwhile territories in Northern France. But he was told in no uncertain terms by the barons, you are under the law, and they extracted from him the first charter between a monarch and the people. And you know, that enormously important historical event is, in a sense, the beginning of the endeavour of the international community ever since then to build limits on power. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and people who are not under the rule of law can become tyrannous and cruel. And not all of you have had the time, and I understand that, to read the report of the Commission of Inquiry on North Korea. I was actually appointed to be the chair of a Commission of Inquiry. The Commission of Inquiry was, in a sense, the successor to the role of the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in DPRK, established by the Human Rights Council in Geneva. And that office holder was Marzuki Darusman, former Prosecutor General and former Attorney General of Indonesia, a very experienced lawyer. He hadn't been looking at law solely as a discipline and an academic interest. He had trodden the boards of the courts and he'd upheld anti-corruption and other controversial issues in Indonesia. And the other commissioner of the COI, the Commission of Inquiry, was Sonia Biserko, who was an expert in human rights from the angle of genocide. And she was appointed to be the third member of the Commission of Inquiry. And our task was, within effectively 7 months, it looks like a year on paper, but by the time we'd been appointed and by the time we got going and we had our secretariat and we met for the first time on the 1st of July 2013 in the Palais Wilson in Geneva, time had been lost. And we had to get our report done by the middle of March 2014, and therefore working backwards it had to be translated into the 6 languages of the United Nations, and that effectively meant we had to get it done by the first week of January 2014. And that meant we had essentially 6 months. And we knew we would never get into North Korea. We knew they would never let us in because their strategy for 70 years has been to pull up the drawbridge, close the windows, shut the access, allow a few tourists in but always under guard, chased if they ever get out of the range of their minders. Their strategy has been no engagement. And so then we faced a challenge. And the way we deal with that type of challenge in the Anglo-Canadian, Australian, American legal system is we don't let people say, well, we're not going to deal with you. We then look for different ways to gather the testimony and to secure reliable evidence on which to base our report. So my colleagues agreed with me that what we should do is what Justice Iacobucci would have done if he got this, and what he did in his very important inquiries into the indigenous people and the wrongs that have been done in that. Public hearings, public inquiries, transparency, everything on the table. No more secrets, no more silos. And so we had public hearings in Seoul, in Tokyo, in London, in Washington, and we gathered there the testimony of the people who had suffered. People said to me, if you can't get in there, how can you get testimony? How can you get reliable testimony? We had no difficulty, ladies and gentlemen. We advertised, we were swamped with people, most of them in the Republic of Korea, South Korea, and they came forward and wanted to speak to us, to tell of their stories. It's a bit like Holocaust museums. If you've been into Holocaust museums, you know that they have videos going all the time of people who suffered in the most horrendous way and who tell their stories in a chronological, matter-of-fact, understated fashion. And that's what they did. They came along before us. Their testimony, if we judged it to be safe, was filmed. It's online. You can Google it tonight. Hour after hour of people telling very sobering stories of the great wrongs they'd suffered. We had a mandate with 10 headings in it, and we carefully went through the witnesses, and when we felt we had enough on each of the headings with a representative sample, we had to cut off the numbers of witnesses. We would never have got our report written if we kept on taking evidence. And so we wrote our report, and if I can say so, every word in the report was weighed by me, because I've read so many UN reports. They are impenetrable often. And often, through nobody's fault, they've been written by somebody who's working in a language other than their mother tongue. And I made sure that our report is readable. And when it was produced to the Human Rights Council in March 2014, it created something of a sensation. Because here it all was, the prison camps, 1 million people dying of starvation whilst the country developed a nuclear arsenal, the denigration of women, the difficulty of people trying to escape through China and being sent back by China to face certain punishment, the classification of people by the Songbird system into a caste system of whether they were favourable to the regime or hostile to the regime. The lack of any access to international news, the absence of the internet. They have an intranet, which about 2.5 million people have access to, but the internet is preserved only for the very small elite, which supports the regime and lives in Pyongyang. And so all of these issues of religious freedom, the destruction of the Christian religion in North Korea, all of these issues are dealt with in the report, and because it was readable, it created a big splash, and that was good, because that was a response to the North Korean enigma of cutting themselves off. It was adopted by the Human Rights Council by a vote of 30 to 6 to 11. Now that is a very big vote in the highly divided Human Rights Council. 30 nations supported the report. That was then sent to the General Assembly. It went first into the third committee of the General Assembly, and then from there to the plenary, where it gathered more votes. It was there 120 to 20 to 55. The 55 being abstentions, but a very strong vote in the General Assembly. To gather 120 nations in the General Assembly is very rare. And in the report was a recommendation that the report be referred to the Security Council with a view to the referral by the Security Council of the case of DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, to the International Criminal Court. And there was a provision in the Charter of the United Nations, not always known. I don't think Professor Julius Stone taught me about this provision back in the 1960s when I was studying international law. It's a provision copied from the Covenant of the League of Nations. And it says, whereas for substantive resolutions of the Security Council, the motion must have the support of the P5, the permanent 5 members: China, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Russian Federation. In procedural motions, it's enough that you get a 2/3 number of the Security Council. And the supporters, the French Republic, the United States of America and Australia, which was temporarily a non-permanent member, gathered together more than the 2/3. They gathered, in the end, Argentina came into support, so the vote there was 11 to 2. The 11 members included the permanent members, the Russian, the United Kingdom, the United States, and France. And the 2 who voted against were the Russian Federation and China. And the 2 who abstained were Chad and Nigeria. But Rwanda voted for it. Rwanda said, we know what crimes against humanity means, and we're voting for this proposal. So that is where it is. And when I appeared before the House of Commons Committee on International Affairs, Subcommittee on Human Rights, on Tuesday in Ottawa, the issue that most concerned the committee was, what can we now do practically to take the matter forward so that this isn't just another UN report, but is a report that has made a difference for the human rights of the people of North Korea. If you want to see and read about suffering, please Google our public hearings. You will hear the witnesses telling of the great wrongs they've undergone, and the people and the members of their family have died. 1 million out of a population of 24 million perished in the famine in the mid-1990s. Just imagine if in Australia or Canada we lost 1 million of our population 20 years ago. It would take us a century if we ever got over such a loss. But that's just part of life in North Korea. We found that it was a totalitarian state, not content to controlling the bodies of people, but seeking to take demand over their minds and over their way of thinking. It is a country now which has developed a nuclear capacity. This was not itself a matter that we were investigating, but you can't ignore in a human rights inquiry the fact that this country has a nuclear arsenal of, no one quite knows how many, but it's estimated between 15 and 20 nuclear warheads, miniaturized for delivery on an increasingly sophisticated missile delivery system, and able to be delivered by an increasingly sophisticated submarine system. And it has the 4th or 5th largest standing army in the world. This for a country of 23 million which has no significant economic potential. It denounced the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. As citizens of the world, we must all be very concerned about the growing number of countries outside the Non-Proliferation Treaty. A person of my age remembers the mushroom cloud. It was burned onto the consciousness of any child who was at school in the immediate post-war period. And people have forgotten about this, but just an accident, just a mistake, just retaliation, just the kind of violence that led to the death of the uncle of the Supreme Leader. A violent country without the rule of law, that abuses human rights, is a very dangerous country from the point of view of the peace and security of the world. And that is why I believe 11 members of the General Assembly placed the matter on its agenda, of the Security Council put the matter on its agenda. I don't now hold a mandate. My mandate was concluded when I delivered the report to the Human Rights Council. The Special Rapporteur, Mr. Durrasman, still holds the mandate. Still, North Korea will not allow him to go into their country. North Korea is, however, under increasing scrutiny of the United Nations. Thanks to the Republic of Korea agreement, a field office is being established in South Korea, in Seoul, which will continue to gather testimony and continue to get the evidence, just as we did, and in the form that could one day be used in an international tribunal or court for the purpose of bringing those who are responsible for crimes against humanity to accountability. And I thank the government of South Korea for agreeing to that step. In South Korea, the issue of relations with North Korea is a very sensitive question. For others, it may not be so easy to understand, but if your brothers and sisters and uncles and relatives are in the North, barred from any contact with you, it's like living with Alberta and with British Columbia and just cut off from them and unable to have contact. And for us in Australia to be cut off from parts of Queensland or parts of our own country, it's a shocking thing, and it's a cruel thing. So basically that's where we are, and it's a riddle inside, an enigma and a mystery, as Winston Churchill said, but light has been shone. And I have to tell you that this is one case, whatever the disappointments in other cases, where the United Nations has done everything it should have done in the defence of universal human rights and peace and security. And the final chapters of the story of North Korean crimes against humanity have not yet been written, but one day they will be known, and I believe that the work of the United Nations Commission of Inquiry on North Korea will have been a useful contribution for the rights of the people of North Korea. So that's the remarks, and we will now have some questions. Are there any questions? Any questions or comments? You don't have to agree with anything I've said. I'm an ex now, so any questions over here? Yes.
I'm just curious, you began, I think, by saying, what's the practical impact of this? What could one expect this report to do to influence in the slightest the current regime? Does it encourage the opposition? What's your theory about how that's supposed to work?
Well, keep in mind that my task was limited. I'm not a diplomat, and I'm not a military person. It wasn't my job to find a geopolitical solution. It was my job to find facts about breaches of universal human rights. And that's what the Commission of Inquiry did. People asked us to stay on. Keep doing it, you're doing such a good job. No, we're not staying on. We've done the essence of our job. The responsibility now rests with the nation states. You don't need more evidence. There's plenty of evidence. The report is online. It's very readable. It's now the responsibility of the nation states. So the theory of it is that if you produce a report which is so damning, so horrible, that ultimately the nation states in the Security Council, working together in that beautiful room in New York, will find a solution. They have in the past twice referred a matter to the International Criminal Court. Once in the case of Darfur, and once in the case of Libya before the fall of Gaddafi. So it does happen. It has happened. They did, as you remember, with the downing of MH17. Now that was very close to the geopolitical interests of the Russian Federation. And yet, in that room, when they had a practical problem of inspection, notation, photographing the site, collecting the bodies, transferring them to the Netherlands, conducting an inquest, conducting an inquiry, they found enough common humanity to find a way to do it. And so when people say to me, well, you can't expect Russia and China to change their attitude, I'm not so sure. Russia and China are members of the Security Council. They have great power. China very rarely uses the veto. It isn't the way China tends to do international affairs. I think in the whole time the PRC has had the China seat, they've only used the veto 10 times. And therefore it's not the normal way China does international law. So that what we've done, we've changed the dynamic from being private, secret, unknown. It's now out there on the table. It's as if in the 1930s, someone had done an inquiry on Nazi Germany and had placed it on the table of the League, and you couldn't ignore it. And that's what we have to hope. As well as that, the establishment of the field office, which is going to continue the work, will continue it until in due course of time the international community takes the steps that should be taken. Any other questions?
One here.
Yes.
First of all, thank you for the extraordinary work that you're doing. You mentioned that the success of the Security Council really hinged on this distinction between substantive and procedural, and that it's only succeeded 4 times. There is a lot of argument in international law that referral to the International Criminal Court masquerades as a procedure, but is in fact substantive. Did you run into it? How did you deal with it? And what do you think the future of that tiny crack, and the ability to classify as procedural, will have a new future?
Well, we haven't got to that point yet, because so far the only step that has been taken is the step of placing it on the agenda of the Security Council, which is undoubtedly a procedural matter, or has been. China suggested that this was a substantive procedural matter, but in the end they didn't push that. And in fact, they both, China and the Russian Federation, voted against. They voted by a show of hands, and those 2 countries voted against, undoubtedly voted against, in a substantive motion that would have been fatal, but it was taken as not fatal to the procedural matter of putting it on the agenda. It's on the agenda under the rules of the Security Council. It remains on the agenda now for 3 years. And even after that, before that 3 years is reached, if one member of the Security Council asks that it remain on the agenda, it remains on the agenda. So the likelihood is it'll be on the agenda for a long time. And so that means it's there. They've already adopted some resolutions on North Korea. For example, they adopted a resolution banning the supply of military material to North Korea. And there is a special committee which monitors the United Nations Committee, which monitors the supply of military material to North Korea. You may remember a vessel was watched on a satellite off the north coast of Cuba, remaining there for quite a while, and then it went down to the Panama Canal, and in the Panama Canal it was apprehended and it was searched. On the top they ultimately found some secret holes. Then in the secret holes there were a lot of bags of sugar, a major export commodity of Cuba, not a popular export commodity because there's a huge oversupply of sugar in the world, but there were these big bags of sugar, and when they took the bags of sugar away, there were spare parts of MiG fighters of the kind that North Korea had received during the time it received the Soviet Union support until the fall of the Berlin Wall. And they were all confiscated and the crew were arrested. And so there's work done by the United Nations Security Council. And China cannot be happy with the fact that the country which adjoins it is a country which has a number of nuclear weapons and is a country which executed Jiang Song-tek, who was the uncle by marriage of the Supreme Leader, but who was reported to be the person in the 2nd or 3rd highest ranking position in North Korea who was advocating the China path, that North Korea should modify the approach that had been adopted in recent times and go down the China path of engagement with the West, opening up of its economy and improving the standards of living of the people, which is itself a human rights necessity. Any other questions? Yes.
Justice Kirby, thank you so much for speaking us today. I wondered if you could comment on the applicability of responsibility to protect principle in light of the fact that crimes against humanity is one of the 4 R2P crimes, and if so, how do we go about exercising responsibility when clearly the North Korean regime is failing to protect its people?
Well, all of this is R2P is sort of internal UN type lingo, which means that where a country is not willing to or able to deliver the essential protections against great international crimes, such as crimes against humanity, it is the responsibility of the international community to step in and ensure that those crimes are prevented. The way to give effect to that would be to refer North Korea to the International Criminal Court, which hasn't yet happened. But it's not at all certain that that won't happen, as far as I'm concerned, and that would be the most effective. We went in our report through the various possibilities, set up an ad hoc tribunal like the Yugoslavia tribunal, set up a joint tribunal like the Cambodian tribunal, but we didn't think the courts in North Korea, if the trial of Jang Song-tek was any guide, would be a perfect example for a joint tribunal. Give the documents to a prosecutor without a court, so that the prosecutor could have it all ready if in fact a court can be found. We went through all those possibilities, but we concluded that the most efficient, effective way of fulfilling R2P would be by referring the matter to the International Criminal Court. So quite a lot of people have said to me since our report was delivered, don't you think this all demonstrates that we must get rid of the veto? But I'm not so sure, because if we look back on the history of the League, we didn't get effectiveness in the League because there was not enough protection for the speciality of the power of the great powers. And the fact is, we have survived for 70 years of the United Nations with a lot of good things done by the United Nations, including the building of the International Law of Human Rights. And we've done that because of the veto, effectively. And I think there's a real doubt that the United States Senate would have approved the Charter if there had not been a veto, and I'm absolutely certain Stalin would have approved the Charter without the veto. So sometimes great principles meet great realities, and I think this is what you can see in the provision of the Charter requiring the participation of the Permanent Five. I remember Julia Stone teaching me in my law school the amazing story of how the Korean War broke out and how the United Nations responded so quickly. Mr. Wyszynski had marched out of the Security Council in protest against the failure of the United Nations to accredit the PRC as the representative for the China seat. And so for a very short time between July and August, Russia, the Soviet Union, had vacated its seat, and that was taken as a decision by them that they would not exercise their veto. Of course, once the Korean War was authorised under the flag of the United Nations, Mr. Wyszynski, in a great flurry with all of his papers everywhere, came rushing back into the Security Council. But it was too late then. It would have required the veto to overcome the decision that had already been made. And I remember Julia Stone raising the question, was this legal under international law? But whether it was purely legal under the Charter, it was something that happened, and the forces of Canada and Australia and the United States and the Republic of Korea worked together and ultimately turned back the hordes of North Koreans who came down. There's an interesting footnote in our report. The former president of the Soviet Union, Mr. Yeltsin of the Russian Federation, released access to the Soviet archives. And the Soviet archives are available, and indeed in the English language you can access them. And they reveal how Kim Il-sung went to Stalin repeatedly asking for agreement for an attack on ROK. And Stalin resisted it for a long time, but in the end he agreed, but said, we will supply no troops You've got to do this on your own. And that is, of course, what happened. North Korea says it was attacked by the Republic of Korea, but the contemporaneous records available in the archives indicate that it was exactly as ROK said. They were attacked unsuspecting, and they were almost driven back to the sea. And then you remember General MacArthur came, and an amazing amphibious landing at Incheon got behind them, and that turned the battle back to the Yalu River, at which point huge numbers of Chinese volunteers, so-called volunteers, came rushing into Korea, and that was the story of the Korean War, a most painful, cruel and murderous campaign. A lot of people dead, a lot of Canadian and Australian and American and other soldiers, and many families divided. They have a lottery. North Korea gives a lottery to allow people to make a bid to meet their family. Often they cancel the lottery at the last minute, so cruelly. But 80 families a year are generally allowed to have a very brief, fleeting meeting with members of their family up in the north. You can't post a letter from the north to the south, or for that matter, the south to the north. You can't telephone between the two Koreas. You can't talk by Skype. You can't contact relatives even if you know that they are there. Many don't know that they are there. One woman gave evidence in our inquiry. She said, my husband was hiding. They rushed in and I kept as quiet as I could. He kept quiet. They rushed out. And then he came down, relieved that the North Koreans had gone, but then they came back and they seized my husband. They took him with them. I haven't seen him. 60 years I haven't seen him. If only I could have thrown my body on him. If only I could have embraced him before they seized him. I miss him every day. These are the stories of ordinary people telling the cruelty and unkindness of what has been the history of the Korean Peninsula over the last 50 years, 60, 70 years. I told the ambassador that when I was in Salzburg only last week, one of the speakers, who was an ambassador in North Korea, illustrated her talk with slides. The slides had photographs of Pyongyang, surprisingly a big modern city but very empty streets. And there were slides of gardens and the big statues and all the familiar things. But then there were slides of children. They were about 10 to 15. They were dressed in very cheap looking Chinese made cheetahs, wind cheetahs, because it's very, very cold in Korea at various seasons. And I stared at the faces of these little children. And I think every time one talks about Korea, one should have photos of the children. One should have the photos of the children to remind us that we're not talking about ogres here. We're not talking only about politicians who have cruel and totalitarian ideas. We're talking about very vulnerable, young, not so young, old people who have suffered greatly, suffered famine, starvation, whose government has spent the money that should have been spent on feeding them, on developing a nuclear arsenal, and who are a risk and a danger to humanity and to the world. But ultimately, these are fellow brothers and sisters. And ultimately, we've got to find a solution. And ultimately, the only chance of finding a peaceful solution, for no other solution is viable, is through the processes of the United Nations. And ultimately, after decades of neglect, the United Nations created an inquiry. And And the inquiry did exactly what it should do. But it did it in a different way. It did it by public hearings, openness, transparency, that it's all there, and now it's our responsibility and our leaders' responsibility. And we as citizens have to make sure that it's a responsibility that's fulfilled.
Before we wrap up, so we can rejoin the conference, His Excellency wanted the final word. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. I didn't mean to have a stand again, but having heard Michael's very touching story, let me share one of my personal story and also one that reminds me one of my personal story and one historical facts regarding a Canadian history. I really appreciate your great contribution in this matter, and this reminds me when I was the first time I visited North Korea actually it's about a little more than 12 years. And I was attending a meeting with North Korean counterpart on the nuclear light water reactor project. And we had about 1 week conference, which is located in the about 2 hours driving distance from Pyongyang, which is called Sunan City. And after my trip back to Seoul, almost a month I couldn't eat. Every time every time I was sitting at the table, the Koreans have kimchi. It's a main staple. It's I don't know whether you know kimchi is a cabbage with the hot pepper. And whenever I see this kimchi with hot red pepper, I'm thinking about North Korean brothers and sisters there. Because it reminds me, when I was there, I was staying in the hotel, very expensive hotel at that time, $112 US per night. Very small room, but it's very expensive. And every time we have a dinner, they have a white kimchi. It's because they do not even have a hot pepper, short of food supplies. That was the reason. So that was, I couldn't even, I couldn't forget about those, my brother's suffering. And so it lasted almost 1 month. And when I was in Libya, I was, rather than Libya, I would like to focus on these historical facts. The Canadians made a great history, great contribution in the, when we go back to this history, you may be well aware of this, this Canadian contribution during Korean War. And you have made a great contribution. And if you go back to the about 100 years ago, Dr. Schofield, who is from Toronto University, a great Canadian, he made a extraordinary contribution, which is he was one of the 200 Canadian missionary, and we had at that time a lot of missionaries from many Western countries, but he was unique. Very unique, because he was the only one when we had about 960, it was 1919, so 94 years ago we had an independence movement because we were under the Japanese colonial rule. That was the first major independence movement. And Dr. Schofield was the one who actually let international community know that there is an independence movement from Korean in the Korean territory. He was the only one. The others were silent because they were afraid, or they were just following the rule of, at the time, Japanese colonial rule. But he was the only one who was vocal, and he couldn't resist that because of his I think it's because of his his conscience or his a sense of global citizen at the time. So he made a great difference, and he's buried in the National Cemetery, which has we have 33 Korean great contributors buried in the National Cemetery to commemorate. And the Schofield is buried right beside, and he is the only foreigner who are buried in the Korean National Cemetery, commemorating this the independence movement. So the reason why I'm reminding you of these historical facts is that Canadians have made a great, extraordinary contribution in making Korea's today. And the presence of your presence today, I think, is also it's a sign, and it's an evidence that you are making a difference by having a attention and spending time on this issue, because not many people nowadays is ready to bother on this kind of issue because they are preoccupied with so many other things. But Canadians is different. So that's something I really have a very high respect, and something I owe to Canada. So when I was in Libya, it's about 4 years ago, I was under the living in the war zone, and NATO was bombing and 9 times about during those 3 months period. And I stayed in Tripoli, and I thought about this time. I thought about not North Korean brothers and sisters, but Libyan brothers and sisters who are suffering. And this was something I learned from 25 years ago when I was based in Canada as a global citizen. And you made another contribution, that you made one Korean who became a global citizen, who is thinking about Libya, not Korea, not any other country. It's totally different countries from different culture and different history. But I was really concerned about those safety. And so what I'm trying to say is, by your attention and by your presence here today, is making a great contribution to the Korean society. I mean, the North Korean nuclear human rights issues. So again, I really appreciate, and I want you to remind your younger generation that you have such a proud history. And if you could make this kind of contribution, this contribution, then I think one day we can solve this very sad issue. We can accomplish something in the near future. Thank you so much.